What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. Now, today I wanted to bring to you a card discussion on Meister. Now, Meister is one of those older cards that, like a lot of older cards, fall in and out of different formats, just depending on how the meta shapes up and if the card is actually relevant enough to be extremely viable. And Meister is, while it might not be the most useful card at the present moment, it's going to become a lot more viable once we get Link format in July, and so I really wanted to make you guys aware of that and kind of just bring this card to light. So Meister, for those of you guys who don't know, is a dark level 4 fiend type monster with 1700 attack and 400 defense, and his effect reads that during either player's turn, when a card effect is activated in your opponent's graveyard, you can discard this card and negate that effect. Now, Meister is really cool, not only just because of its effect, but because of its base stats, and I want to take a moment to discuss that. Like most hand traps, most hand traps have some of the shittiest stats you could possibly imagine, but Meister actually isn't like that. Meister actually has a 1700 attack body, which means that in an extremely simplified game state, let's say you top deck this card, you could play it and actually start beating your opponent in for some significant damage, and if they don't have a way to answer it, then Meister could maybe potentially win you a game or two just solely off of its attack power alone. I mean, when you're comparing this card to cards like Ghost Ogre or Ash Blossom, having that 1700 attack on a hand trap gives it some nice flexibility in how the card can be used. I also like this card a lot because it's a level 4, which means that, since the rank 4 pool is arguably the strongest pool in the entire game when it comes to Xyz monsters, and especially since the best deck being ZOODIAC is comprised of level 4 monsters, it has some natural synergy there compared to some other hand traps that are usually level 1 or maybe even level 3. So the level 4 actually does matter when it does come to maybe possibly needing to make an Xyz play in a pinch. And then lastly, its attribute. The fact that it's a dark attribute is so cool because arguably dark attribute has the most support, the best generic support I would say in the entire game. This means you have flexibility with cards like Allure of Darkness, and if you're throwing it into like a dark synchro deck, you've got things like you can pitch it for Dark Grepher or like all these other different things like that. But ultimately, like, the dark attribute just has so much viability and relevance, maybe not at this exact moment, but when it comes to just complete archetype support, attribute support, this card really can come down to it when you need a dark monster. But its effect is what we're here to talk about. I just wanted to cover the stats because it's something unique to the card. But moving on to the effect. Now, the effect is really good for several different reasons. So let's take a look at the best deck, arguably, this format, which is ZOODIAC, and ZOODIAC doesn't really have a lot of stuff that triggers in the grave, but one of the strongest cards that does trigger in the grave is ZOODIAC RAMRAM, and so if you can possibly discard your Meister to prevent the activation of RAMRAM, that's really important, because a lot of players, especially at the higher skill levels, what they'll do is they'll use their Chalk-9 to float back out their RAMRAM, so that if you have a board wipe, they can still, you drop the Dark Hole, RAMRAM gets destroyed, they trigger the RAMRAM, they summon a Trident, and most likely they're going to have a Whiptail in hand that they can equip under the Trident so that they still have that removal even though you hit them with the board wipe. Well, Meister can pretty much prevent that altogether because you can negate RAMRAM's effect, and then you don't have to worry about it. And then another deck that this is really relevant against is True DRACO. Now, True DRACO, while this may not apply to the monsters themselves, I think one of the most annoying aspects of this deck that any one of us has to deal with is the fact that with cards like True DRACO Heritage or True King's Return, when they're sent to the graveyard, they're going to be popping either one of our monsters or one of our spell and trap cards, and this is mostly in part thanks to Dragonic Diagram, although at the same time they could just set one of them in tribute for something like Majesty's Maiden or Dynamite Fighter. But when these cards go to the graveyard, they're going to be popping something, and that's how the True DRACO deck really kind of levels out its advantage and takes advantage of, the archetype itself. So by having a card like Meister, let's say that they're targeting one of your set cards. Well, that's actually one of the best case scenarios because a set card on your field can't be destroyed by Masterpiece, and let's say that it's a card that can pretty much save you the entire game. If you choose to at that moment, use your Skullmeister to stop that set card from being destroyed, and it can just pay off in the long run, then it's absolutely worth it to have your Skullmeister use that negation in that instance. But it can also more practically stop the destruction of a monster that you don't want to get killed, something such as Trident, because more often than not, if they have the ability to clear off the Trident, they're going to do so before they extend into any of their stronger plays, and if you keep Trident on the field, that means that you have the potential to pop their Diagram or maybe even pop their Heritage when they bring that out onto the field. So being able to keep as many of your resources on the board as possible, especially if you went first, is something that you really can't argue against. Now, the strongest application for Skullmeister, and this is actually the reason why if you look at the OCG, players are siding 2 to 3 copies almost in every single sideboard with Skullmeister, is True King Dinosaurs. Now, I know True King Dinosaurs in our current format isn't really doing a whole lot because we still have ZOODIAC, you know, pretty much with Barrage at 3, Trident at 3, all that fun stuff, but we also still have True Draco running around as well. But True King Dinosaurs in the OCG is not far behind. It's pretty much taking up about 20% of their meta, and that's a significant chunk that you have to worry about. And Skullmeister has the highest application going up against that deck. Take, for instance, you know, the pure monster lineup of that deck. Most importantly, I think being able to hit something like a BABYCERASAURUS or even a PETITERANODON that gets destroyed off of either Diagram or something like Lithosygym is insane, because that's really how the deck gets going. By popping those baby dinosaurs, it extends their ability to summon cards like Oviraptor and Miscellaneousaurus, and really whatever cards they need to just enable the rest of their play. So being able to negate that initial activation is absolutely huge. And speaking of Miscellaneousaurus, you can also negate Miscellaneousaurus in graveyard as well, and that could be potentially big because a lot of people sometimes will just pitch the Miscellaneousaurus from their hand. The effect doesn't really matter, but they'll do it just so they can get the graveyard effect to special summon something out of the graveyard. And being able to deny that sort of ability to just summon a monster from the deck, again, Miscellaneousaurus is another starter card in that respect, that if you're able to negate it, it could potentially stop their plays, because depending on the instance of how they're using Miscellaneousaurus, it could be a desperation play that they really don't have a lot else that they can actually use that's formidable enough against whatever you're playing against. So being able to hone in on their weakness and really instinctually knowing that that's pretty much their best play, Skullmeister can be absolutely devastating. Now, last but not least, you know, there is the Yang Zings as well, because a lot of people are splashing a couple Yang Zings into their True King Dinosaur decks, and if the Yang Zing cards are destroyed, they do have the effect to float, so you can use a Skullmeister to negate that effect, and that can be absolutely huge, because one of the most annoying things to deal with the Yang Zings is their ability to float into one another and continuously chain to do so, so being able to stop that chain of summons is absolutely huge. Now, the biggest thing about Skullmeister is it's had a very large point of contention when it comes to rulings. In the TCG in the past, Skullmeister has actually been ruled that you could use it during the damage step. Now, in the OCG, you're not allowed to use it during the damage step, but this makes a very big difference, because this means if you run over something like a Yang Zing or even a RAMRAM in battle, you can Skullmeister it during the damage step, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to, because this is when these effects trigger, and it can actually make the difference depending on the types of games that really how the game states essentially devolve into. So if you're able to use this card in the damage step, it just gives the card even more just good application. But the thing is, this is still a ruling that's still in contention. So the biggest thing is, if you're playing Skullmeister and you're going to a larger event like a regional or a YCS, definitely first thing you should do after you register, when you get to the event, you should ask your head judge what the ruling is on Skullmeister, so that you know ahead of time and you know how the card should properly function. Now, just like any other card, Skullmeister does have its weaknesses, and I think the biggest weakness of this card is that it's very niche in its application. Sure, it's extremely powerful in the areas where it excels, but compared to something like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre, because we have referenced those cards a couple times in this video already, you know, Ghost Ogre and Ash Blossom can hit so many more powerful cards a lot more often than something like Skullmeister. And especially going up against the strongest deck being ZOODIAC, you know, there's only the RAMRAM that you can really stop with Skullmeister. I mean, you could, like, maybe hit a few other cards here and there just depending on what they go into, but more often than not, you're better off using other options, most notably Ghost Ogre or Ash Blossom or other things like that, because they just have a much wider field of cards that they're going to be hitting, and they're going to be hitting them a lot more often. You know, things like Diagram, Barrage, you know, the Rat Pier on the normal summon, this, the effect of Broad Bowl, things like that. There's just so much more value in those other cards. Now, and the last thing I want to discuss is, this card's fucking expensive. If you don't already have your copies, this card currently is running at a minimum of around $20, thanks Star Strike Blast. So, if you don't have your copies of this card already, it's a very expensive card to get your hands on. Now, to be fair though, we don't exactly need this card until Link format, which comes in July. But we are getting a reprint of this card in, I believe, September or October, so that will definitely bring the price down. And at the same time, we're not really going to have any large-scale tournaments. Maybe if you have a regionals or something coming up during the Link format, then if that's the case, you could just wait to pick up your copies of Skullmeister, and then you'll be good to go for the Link format, and you'll have your options for, you know, the True King Dino deck, or whatever other use you might see Skullmeister for. But in between that time for when Link Summoning comes out, and when Skullmeister is going to be reprinted, there's about a 2-month window there that we're going to go without having this card being reprinted, and it's going to be rather expensive. So, you know, if you already have the card, that's fantastic, but if not, if you don't have any big tournaments coming up, best thing you could probably do is wait till the reprint and then pick them up as a nice, cheap super rare. But guys, that's going to do it for today's video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Skullmeister and its viability moving forward, not only just in the, like, remaining month of our June 12th format, but also in Link format, where I think it's gonna really shine much more than it could possibly now. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked the video, be sure to like the video. As always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.